I get into the review, I'd just like to say two things. The first of all, when this was announced, I was somewhat hesitant, as it was by Danny Boyle. Now, don't get me wrong, I think Danny Boyle's a great director. I think Trainspotting was a great film, and 28 Days and 28 Weeks Later were also great. But after that, I don't know, I just don't think his projects were that great afterwards, and I still hold a grudge because of what happened with T2 Trainspotting. I think visual, great, but wasn't a big fan of the plot. But anyway, I had that in mind, but then once I watched the first episode, honestly, I knew it was going to be as great as it was. The second thing is, in this review, I'd just like to say fuck you to The Guardian, fuck you to John Lydon, and fuck you to Malcolm McLaren. Now I'm going to get into those reasons, starting off with John Lydon. The reason I say fuck you to John Lydon is because the main publicity this show is getting is quite negative, and from him claiming that he's not involved or they didn't contact him. I think the main reason is it's his ego. They didn't ask him because he's not involved. It's not necessarily about him. It's more about Steve Jones, who personally I think is the better Sex Pistols member, more interesting. Yeah, Johnny Rotten and Sid Vicious, they got the headlines, but he was the best of them. He was the better one, personally. Anyway, in this, it's based on his opinion. It's based on the book Lonely Boy that he wrote not long ago. And we're seeing how he perceived how the Sex Pistols came along. We find out a lot about him. The fact that he actually couldn't really read or write. The fact that he is a terrible guitar player up until he spent a week on drugs learning how to play properly. We find out that he was actually originally supposed to be the singer before he had stage fright, and Malcolm insisted he be the guitarist, replacing the original guitarist who was called Wally. But the main reason they replaced him is because Malcolm said that people with glasses don't belong in rock and roll, even though John Lennon and Buddy Holly, but that's besides the point. Yeah, we also learned that sadly as a child he was abused by his stepdad, and we also find out it's because of that of his sex addiction, and not only that, but his somewhat low self-esteem, as his dad always undermined him, saying he was a lazy sod up to no good. And I'm glad that Steve Jones showed him up. What I did find interesting about the show is, as a fan of the Sex Pistols, you find out so much about them. For example, Malcolm's partner Vivian, who set up the audition, set it up for someone called John, but we later find out that it wasn't for Johnny Rotten, it was actually for John, who we now know as Sid Vicious, as they both shared that name. So it's interesting to the fact that Vicious was always going to be in the band. Like, it was either going to be the singer or he would later become the bassist. Either way, he would have been in. I still find that very interesting. Even though it is made and funded by Disney, it's nice to see that they did not censor it whatsoever. In this show we get the foulest of language, we get quite graphic imagery, whether sexual or violence. We see stuff that you're like, oh shit, okay. You kind of forget it's produced by Disney. It's kind of funny at the same time. They didn't take away the punk spirit that this show brought. When it comes to visuals, I think this show does a very cool and creative choice of, instead of making it look modern but obviously how it's set in the 70s, they make it look a bit grainy, and this filter, it honestly looks really cool. It does look like we as the audience are in the 70s watching this. Hands down, a great thing for them to do. Also, another thing I really enjoyed about this show is humour. Very hysterical. I think nearly every character has their moment, but I think Steve Jones was the funniest of them all, obviously because it's based on him, but still. And when it comes to performances, I think everyone did an exceptional job. Obviously, I think not only the cast, but the creators and the set makers, the clothing. What I liked about this show is you knew it wasn't a cash grab, because they could have easily been very lazy with it. There's moments you could they really put art and detail into it, and it shows that Danny Boyle, and along with everyone else, they wanted to make sure they were doing a brilliant homage to what was a great moment in history. Not only have we got the cast, who do an exceptional job pulling off mannerisms with John Lydon, who is very difficult to pull off, but Malcolm McLaren as well, who wasn't on camera that much. Still, the actor who pulled it off did a great job. The person who played Johnny Rotten did a great job. But the main thing I don't think is getting talked about enough is the fact that the band members had to learn how to play the instruments. And not only that, learn how to play the instruments and sound exactly like the people they're playing. Luckily, for the most part, they got to meet who they were playing and perform, except for the actor who played Johnny Rotten. He had to do his own research, and fair play, the man did an exceptional job. Shout out to him, whatever his acting name is, I apologise. Yes, I think they all did a great job, and it just shows that this is not a cash grabbing show. They really put their hard work and effort into it. Now, the reason I say fuck The Guardian is because they alluded in that article that it lacked an emotion or heartwarming moments, when that couldn't be further from the truth. Honestly, from the very first episode we find out about Steve's troubled childhood and what he witnessed, and it's actually quite upsetting. And as we know this is based on real people, it's even more upsetting. And they even make people who normally, like Sid Vicious, I never liked. I thought he was always a moron, drug addict, dope douchebag who got lucky and got his 15 minutes of fame before he overdosed. And they were able to make him somewhat heartwarming. Yes, he was an idiot, but he was an idiot just doing his best. And Johnny Rotten, who now is John Lydon being a bit of a dick, especially with the press he's doing, in this show they make Johnny Rotten they give him humanity. He seems like, even though yes he's an arsehole, he can have his moments of genuine niceness, even if it is added after making quite an off-colour joke. But still, yeah, they were able to make these characters have a lot of humane, heartwarming moments. So I don't know what the fuck The Guardian are talking about, and honestly, they need to put their finger out their arse when talking about certain subjects. That's topic for another day. Another thing that in the show we also see that Steve doesn't really have faith in himself, as no one else has given him that faith, and it's only until he meets Malcolm McLaren and Malcolm McLaren actually gives him that chance and says, no, I think you are worth it, I think you can do this. And we get to see how Malcolm McLaren operates, as not only does he help Steve Jones get the confidence he needs to get with the band and actually believe this could be something more than just a band. And we see that he actually did operate in somewhat a better way. He was able to get them record deals from A&M, EMI and Virgin. Whatever happened to the money, obviously I don't think they got paid. He did screw him on that department, but he was able to get them a deal that would involve getting an album out. He was able to get them tours, even though those tours would cause a lot of stress and violence towards them. He's still able to get them a lot of publicity, whether it was bad or good. He was able to set up the Grundy interview, which was a huge spike in their career, whether you would say a good or a bad way. It changed their lives forever. And he was able to capture a moment with one song just by changing the name. Now, the song that I'm talking about was originally called No Future, but under his guise he decided to change it for God Save the Queen, as it knew it would cause controversy and it would be a huge moment for the band. Now, Johnny Rotten did not want this, as he felt that it wasn't, he was taking the moment away from what the song actually is, and that Britain has no future. But they changed it to God Save the Queen, but I think it was a better idea. I'm not being rude to Rotten, but I think if they had it as that title, it wouldn't have gotten to #1. I don't think all this fuss would have been over that song. I think it would have gotten the charts, it may have got some airplay, but it wouldn't be as big as it is now. It is still impactful now. It's definitely become a revolutionary song for people who are anti-establishment like myself. Now, those are the good things about McLaren, but there's certainly a lot of negatives. Like I said, with the touring, he put them in such fucked up states, playing to hillbillies, quite violent areas with people packing guns ready to kill if they hear anything negative on their part. That's one side. He also manipulated a lot of the band members. Because Steve Jones still believed in him, because he saw him as a father figure to an extent, at least in the show's depiction, Steve Jones would probably do a lot for him. Malcolm used that to his advantage and got him to get rid of band members, or get him to do his dirty work to an extent. Like in the show, we see Glenn Matlock being a bit more clever than the others and kind of questioning Malcolm's decisions whilst the others are obliged with it. And it's at this point we see Malcolm decide to ditch Glenn Matlock and he uses Steve, and it's quite sad really. Another instance, as we see when they're touring America, not only is Steve, Paul and Johnny just getting annoyed. Johnny actually confronts him and says, it's either me or Malcolm. And we actually think, okay, Steve's going to make the choice here. He's going to go by a good decision. But instead, Steve stabs Johnny in the back and goes with Malcolm. And what's worse, I think, is not only that, but he's able to convince Sid, who, from the Nancy debacle, still decides to go with Malcolm rather than his best friend, who actually told him the truth. So yeah, one action which, like, you see how Malcolm's very devious. But the one reason why I say fuck Malcolm McLaren is because in the show, after Nancy is murdered in the hotel and Sid is put away in prison, he is bailed out by McLaren, and instead of keeping a somewhat of an eye on him, making sure he's alright, not going back to his old habits, he leaves him to his own devices, hoping to gain some publicity, but he gets the wrong type of publicity. We hear that Sid takes heroin and overdoses, and he got the heroin from his mum, which is fucked up. But what's worse, there's a particular scene where he's talking about how he got all these t-shirts printed up about Sid and Nancy never die apart, something like that, and how it's annoying that he's got all these made for nothing now that he's dead. He's just like, are you fucking kidding me? A person's died. Yeah, he was a piece of shit, but fucking hell, at least he was something. He was still a human being. And it's really, you just realise that he didn't see the band as human beings, he saw them as puppets. And if those puppets wouldn't do the dancing that he wanted, he'd kick them aside. Vivian actually had a great quote about what type of person he is.
He's just a lost little boy. Malcolm thinks he needs to burn down the forest to find his way home.
Yeah, so that's why I say fuck Malcolm McLaren. Now, when it comes to critiques, I've actually only got like 3. The first one being that when it comes to Paul Cook, I feel like from episode 3 afterwards, he becomes more of a background character. And while yes, it's Steve Jones' story, I feel like the other characters got more than him. I felt like he was a bit left away, which is somewhat sad as I don't know much about Paul Cook, and this could have been the chance to give him a bit more of a show, but fair enough. My second reason is when it came to pacing. Again, after episode 3, I felt like they were jumping a lot to get to the highlights rather than, you know, develop. But again, it was only 6 episodes, which is a shame. And for me personally, I feel like they glossed over certain history parts. But fair enough, you're trying to tell a very strong story, you've only got a certain amount of episodes to do it in. Totally understandable. And my last critique is that they play along with the truth in this show. And there are 3 examples. The fact that Chrissie Hynde and Steve Jones didn't have that much of an intimate relationship. She wasn't around the Sex Pistols era that long, and it was just more for a dramatic effect and to create somewhat of an interesting love story. Fair play to him. The second one is that Glenn Matlock wasn't actually in the Swankers. He was hired to be in the Sex Pistols. By the way, Swankers is what he originally was called before it became Keith Jones and the Sex Pistols, and then the Sex Pistols. Anyway, he was in the band by Malcolm McLaren, and then instead of being kicked out like the show shows it as, he actually decided to leave the band himself as he was sick of Johnny Rotten and his ego, and he couldn't stand to be on the same stage as him, and he knew that the Sid Vicious was being introduced. He just wanted rid of the band as well. He said he would help teach Sid how to play bass, which is actually acknowledged in the show. And then the third one is that Nancy Spungen, she was not taken away to America. They did not send her back. It was actually failed. In the show it seemed somewhat successful. In reality it was definitely not a successful journey. They fucked up. Overall, I had a fun and enjoyable watch, and if this is a thing, I really hope Danny Boyle does this with another band. I'd love to see him attempt to do the Beatles in this way, or another band that he's really passionate about, because I really have enjoyed so much of this. But yeah, it's a shame that's a one-off, but still. Is it good? I'd say it's fucking great. I'd rate it 9 out of 10. When it comes to recommendations, I'd obviously recommend the music. They've only got 1 album, that being Nevermind the Bollocks. Here's the Sex Pistols. And I'd also recommend the documentary The Filth and the Fury, which was the headline used after the Grundy interview. Those are the 2 main things I'd recommend. One thing that I'd recommend, but it's something I haven't seen in quite some time, is Sid and Nancy. If you're interested in their relationship, how it started, how it ended, and how it affected the Sex Pistols, go watch that. A small thing, but there is a parody of the Sex Pistols that the Simpsons did. It was in a one of those triplet episodes where it has 3 stories. It was definitely one of the best stories. But yeah, you may be able to find it on YouTube or Google it.